huge demands on semiconductor capacity, which we're very aware of, sitting as we do in Silicon Valley, and on critical minerals that are needed to support the semiconductor industry. We have issues on climate change and energy security. And to deal with all this, we're seeing some new mechanisms. We're seeing emerging forums, or in fact, what someone called dynamic lattice works, where you have the Quad, 4 countries coming together. You have the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, 14 countries coming together. You have the I2U2, 4 countries in the Middle East, including the US and India. So we've got various mechanisms that are being created because some of the prior mechanisms didn't quite work. And then we see some strong synergies and opportunities that the US and India see jointly in terms of technology, innovation, and global value chains. Finally, both countries are kind of pulled together with a common view or a common, perhaps, distrust of what China wants to do and what are China's goals and what is China's posture. So these are the various things I want to set in terms of context on the US-India situation. And what we have each panelist will focus on a specific part of this. Dinsha will talk about the strategic dimension. I will then pick up on the economic dimension. James will look at the US-India relationship in the context of other dynamics in the world. And Emma will focus on the very important people-to-people foundation of the relationship. I'm not going to introduce each one of them because the bio is in the book that you have. So with that, let me turn it over to Dinsha.
Thank you. Thank you for having me as well. It's a great honor to be here, and I've been learning a lot. I usually work on issues related to education, public health, and the like, but occasionally I make the mistake of commenting about geostrategic affairs.
Hoover conversation with India.
Hoover, yes, the Hoover program in US-India. So I definitely sometimes veer into this lane. I'm going to focus my comments today on just picking up on what Arun said last about this role of an emerging China and how a lot of people say that this should be the basis for a US-India relationship. We've got leaders in the US, in DC talking about how the US-India relationship is going to be the most important in the 21st century because of the threat of China. And I think it's going to be the most important relationship in the 21st century for reasons that have, honestly, very little to do with China. And let me make 3 reasons why I think we should actually think about moving on from this framework of thinking of China as the reason why US and India should connect. So first and foremost, I think that what we see, what the US wants with China, what the concerns are with China, are very different from what India wants and what India's concerns are. India has to be neighbors with China, the frontline power. The challenges that India faces, we all know them, but at the end of the day, India is going to be there 100 years from now, 1,000 years from now, trying to figure out how to make relationship work with China. India's threats are along its border primarily, whereas the US historically has been mostly concerned with Taiwan and the South China Sea. That's a different direction, a different dimension. Obviously, when China does the actions that we see it do, I would personally like to see more collaboration. I certainly think that's an important thing. I think we should be sharing information, talking about China, but basing the relationship on China loses out on a lot of other aspects. So that's the first point. The second point is that just when we take a geostrategic look at the entire region, the region is bigger than China. And I think we would find a lot more convergence, we meaning US, would find a lot more convergence with Indian thinkers when we think about Central Asia, right? When we think about terrorism, when we think about places like Sri Lanka, even when we think about places like the Middle East. I2U2 is a really promising initiative. But there it seems like we've got a lot more to say, a lot more to work with in terms of partnering with India. For instance, right? I think that any kind of policy that the US considers doing now in Central Asia, including in Pakistan, Indians should be at the table talking about it, because I think we have a similar sort of perspective in terms of what we want to see in that region, right? So that's the second point. We can work strategically across a much larger swath than China. Third, I really think that this relationship, it's going to be built on the people-to-people, the economic that you're going to hear. Second largest diaspora in the US right now is Indians, or Indian Americans. one of our fastest growing trade partners, one of our hopes for investment, everything we've been hearing about today, right? The comparisons that we've had with China up until this panel have not been about some kind of potential conflict or anything like that. It's about how India can match China in terms of economic performance, in terms of geostrategic ambition, those sorts of things. Economic performance, these kinds of things are going to really tie in. So I'm much more optimistic about basing a relationship on these areas: energy, health, education, people to people, these kinds of areas. If we focus only on China, say tomorrow something changes with China, right? For instance, say tomorrow, for whatever reason, Xi and the powers that be decide to pull back from the Chinese border. I would hope that India would rush to China with an olive branch, taking up that charge, trying to make peace. If our relationship is based on things like IPEF, Quad, things like that, exclusively checking China, and India suddenly rightly takes an about face, where does that leave these kinds of endeavors? Do we scrap them? Does the US say, okay, we're no longer interested in working with India? That can't be the perspective. We have to take a more grand, broader perspective to the US-India relationship. Now, I think James is going to say why I'm wrong, so we'll have a little bit of a warning tippa. So,
great. Okay, so thank you, Nisha. So your basic point is that don't think that China should be such a dominant influence in a close US-India relationship. And I think most of us would agree with that. I think also current thinking is that nobody wants the world to be two worlds, like a China world and a US world. The US has to work closer with China. There's too much interdependence economically on China. Let me just quickly segue into the kind of economic aspect of the US-India relationship. I want to say that when I worked in the Department of Commerce many years ago, we felt, and it was our conviction, that economics and commerce have to become central to the US-India relationship. And I was really privileged to work with Amitabh, who was extremely good in helping us come together on that conviction. In fact, at that point, today, a lot of the conversations about strategic and defense, at that point, there was a lot more in proportion about commerce and economics. So where do we stand today? I think the last year has probably been the most productive year in the US-India relationship in probably ever, a very long time. And this is borne out by the numbers, by the volume of trade, although not by bilateral trade and investment treaties between the US and India. By an emerging congruence on national and geo-economic priorities, and as I mentioned earlier, by the US and India participating together in these new lattice works of multilateral agreements. And in some of these, really, the US and India are the central players of those agreements, which is important to remember. In terms of numbers, trade doubled over the last 8 years. Major investments have been made. And the COVID pandemic suddenly made clear that you could work remotely across the world. And that's a huge benefit for India and for US-India companies that work together. As well-known US companies, some of the largest companies have their largest or second largest populations in India. And now technology development and technology corporations are undertaking very serious product development efforts from India. There are apparently 300,000 semiconductor circuit designers working out of India in US and global corporations. So I think the economic relationship is very, very strong. We had some impediments in the past, the issues like ease of doing business, which still exists quite a bit, but there's a lot of progress being made. And we see more consistency in policies. I think the GST that was mentioned earlier today and the bankruptcy code that was mentioned earlier today are great examples of wonderful results that we've seen over the last 10 years. I think we have to also accept that today we're living in a world of global supply chains, and these supply chains are intertwined, and India stands to benefit as the world tries to get redundancy from China. When China, as I said, is 25% of global manufacturing, that is enormous. That's an enormous dependency, and it's often a single point of failure, as we found during the COVID pandemic. So there's definitely a push towards more redundancy, and India stands to benefit from that. I think both the US and India have a great desire to boost manufacturing, to create jobs, to have higher skills, as well as for strategic reasons, not to be over-dependent on other sources. I think, therefore, that the US-India collaboration in manufacturing and supply chain has got to be one of the very big plays for the future. And we're seeing this in semiconductors. For strategic reasons, India has great focus on semiconductors. Today, a number of projects were mentioned, which is great to hear. And I think, and as I see the amount of time I've been spending in India for the last 7 years, the quality of manufacturing capabilities in India has significantly improved. I mean, it's really, I mean, it's in many areas, it's globally competitive. And you can see that from the fact that India's automobiles, et cetera, compare with the best in the world in their categories. So manufacturing is actually an area of inherent comparative potential capability for India. I'll spend a second on these lattice works. I think the Quad is very important. The IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, that was briefly mentioned in one of the comments earlier, and India is participating in 3 of the 4 pillars of the IPEF to do with supply chain and so forth. That's important, and those kinds of collaborations will benefit the entire region. The India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor, the IMEC, that was stood up as a result of the G20, is a major strategic move. And in some sense also counter to the Belt and Road Initiative, although the Belt and Road Initiative seems to be getting a bit long in the tooth. But this could be a very dynamic program, and I think that India is very central to that space as well. Technology was mentioned a few times. More and more we'll see increasing collaboration between India and the US in critical and emerging technologies. I think in the future, conversations and even contentions will be less about trade and more about technology. So it's good to see the US and India coming together under the ICET framework. So where do we go from here over the next several years? The economic dimension, I can only see increasing and intense collaboration between the 2 countries in the public sector and the private sector. As India becomes the 3rd largest economy, it will become an increasingly important market for US companies, providing another incentive. Now, you've got to also put this in a bit of perspective. China was very attractive to the US because also a very large internal market. India is growing today at, let's say, 7% or 7.5%, on a base of about 3.7 trillion. China is, the base of China is almost like 20 trillion. So they have a bigger base, and so it's going to take a while for us to catch up to be equally attractive, but I think we could well be on the right direction. Looking even further, how will the dynamics between the US and India go? I would hope that as India becomes more powerful economically, as China has, we're able to manage between the 2 countries a more comfortable dynamic. I think today we see a lot of conversation between the 2 countries, increasing trust, and I hope that can be maintained even as India becomes more and more powerful economically. So looking forward, I'm an optimist, but history is never a straight line. Things can go wrong, but I think the foundations are in place for the 2 countries to work very well together. With that, let me turn it over to James.
Very good, thank you. So I lived in India for 5 years as a foreign correspondent, writing mostly about business, but for the last 7 years I've lived in Singapore looking at geopolitical developments. Most recently I ran the International Institute for Strategic Studies office in Singapore, which runs the Shangri-La Dialog Defense Summit, where the United States, China, and India would attend to talk about regional geopolitical issues. And I suppose without, as Dinsha said, without wanting to reprise the debate we had in the previous session between Pranab Bardhan and Sanjeev Sanyal, my aim here, I think, is to disagree with Dinsha and to say that as far as I can see, it would be nice if the US-India relationship was sort of based in this broad-based way with all sorts of different dimensions in it. But it's very difficult to understand what has happened in terms of the way both sides are cooperating without thinking that China is really the motivating force here. I mean, it seems to me that both sides perceive a common threat, albeit realized in different ways. And both sides get sort of common benefits in terms of a much deeper partnership that has changed the way they approach international affairs. I mean, seen from a US point of view, having India in some form as part of a group of countries that are concerned about China's rise sometimes the like-minded, whatever you want to call it, makes that coalition much more compelling, because otherwise it's simply a coalition of rich industrial countries. And with India there, it's much more diverse. It's also much more geographically broadly spread. And it was for that reason that over a long period of time, I mean, the US policy that has been described towards India as a policy of strategic altruism, meaning anything that's good for India is good for the US. As long as India is rising economically, militarily, then that's helpful to US interests, principally but not exclusively, because it helps balance China in Asia. But from India's point of view, I mean, India is relatively weaker than China economically and militarily. It is in the process of catching up on those two metrics, but it's not there yet. And therefore, its only real option internationally is what the international scholars call external balancing, which means being friends with people with whom you can form partnerships. And while the public rhetoric of India's government often talks a lot about an omnidirectional, multi-directional foreign policy, really what has happened over the last decade is that India has vastly improved its relationship with the United States, with the Quad countries, with Japan and Australia and South Korea, and with the Europeans, because those are the countries from whom you get most benefit in terms of technology, defense cooperation. I mean, it's not exclusively those countries. India has built, strategic relationships with the United Arab Emirates or Israel or any number of other countries. But the most important component are those sort of high-tech industrial nations who provide you with a lot of the things that you need when you're trying to cope with a much larger and pretty aggressive neighbor. And so some of the examples that we talked about already, so ISET, the technology partnership, which has been a very interesting reconfiguration of the US-India relationship around technology. That's not sort of fundamentally about China, but it is a way of building a new form of partnership with sort of China working in the background. I2U2, which you mentioned, the Middle East industrial sort of infrastructure project, I think that's much more directly driven by China, as in, I'm pretty sure that at some level, if the United States and the Europeans hadn't sort of developed that partnership with the Middle Eastern countries, then China would have done it instead. And so often there is a sort of direct competitive relationship. So in a sense, I feel like it's okay to admit that China is the sort of part of the motivating factor here. India and the US do not have identical interests. India is principally concerned about South Asia, the Himalayas and the Indian Ocean, and China's position there. The United States is principally concerned about East Asia and Taiwan. Ashley Tellis wrote that article that many of you will have read last year, saying that the US has made a bad bet on India. He didn't write the headline, but the gist of it was just, we need to be realistic about the fact that the US and India have overlapping interests in some areas, but India isn't going to get involved in a future conflict over Taiwan because it doesn't perceive it to be in its own interest, just in the same way that India didn't join the predominantly Western-led coalition against Russia because it doesn't perceive joining a coalition against Russia to be in its own interests. But at the same time, India, in a sense, I saw the other day an article which said that the India relationship with Russia is in a form of managed decline. As in, if you think of India's strategic portfolio of relationships, it has historically been a bit overweight on Russia and is now going to re-rate in favor of other countries, some of which will be Western and some of which will be, like the United Arab Emirates or Israel. And so India is in, as my former boss, John Chipman, used to say, a sort of process of dynamic portfolio management of its international relations. And it has become more overweight on the US, it's becoming a bit more underweight on Russia, and lying behind that realignment, I think, fundamentally, is the concern about China, and we can agree or disagree on that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Rich. Thank you, James. Emma.
Yeah, I want to focus on the history of the diaspora, where the diaspora has gone, how diaspora can work with India as it gets to 100 years old. So just a quick history on the diaspora. There are about 30 million people who live outside of India, of Indian origin. The first migration happened during colonial rule, when a lot of Indians went as indentured labor to a lot of different countries. That migration stopped when India became independent, And then a new migration started, let's say 30, 40 years ago, when Indians went to study abroad. They went to US and UK and Canada, and now more recently Australia. That set off a complete new trend of migration where people went as qualified, people into geographies where they needed a lot of talent, like the US. And suddenly, the US population of Indian immigrants has grown to almost 5 million now, okay, out of the 30 million. So these are big increases in population to the US, same thing with Canada, same thing with now Australia. Now, almost 3 to 4% of Australia is Indian. Very little known fact. There's 750,000 Indians in Australia, right? So suddenly, a lot of countries are getting a new class of immigrants, highly qualified, highly motivated, and want to generate income, wealth, and they're also tied to India, right? So these are the two different types of diaspora we're dealing with. Is the old diaspora that went as indentured labor, and then the new class of Indians who've gone in as educated people, right? So that's what we're dealing with. Now, as a group together, this 30 million people have helped India tremendously. Last year, it's not gone unnoticed by government officials here in the audience that the diaspora contributed 110 billion, that's B with a billion, of remittances to India last year. And it's only growing every year. These remittances also are changing in terms of demographic. Initially, a lot of money came from the Middle East, where Gulf country workers were sending money. Now that demographic mix has changed to where Western diaspora are investing in India. One of the things that happened recently, I think there was a new apartment complex in Gurgaon that had 1,000 apartments up for sale. I think they closed the deals in 3 days. The fact with that was 25% of those new apartments that ranged from $2 million to $5 million were purchased by the diaspora. So again, the mix is changing in terms of how the diaspora is investing in India, right? So the diaspora can actually contribute both in terms of buying real estate, investing in companies, investing in mutual funds, and so forth, in a very different way than the older diaspora did, okay? So this has to be kept in mind. Now, also, the diaspora is very influential in foreign policy terms, in terms of how it can help India as well, right? There are now 12 prime ministers and presidents of Indian origin in the diaspora, 12. Okay? The prime minister of Portugal, the prime minister of Guyana, the president of Singapore recently was of Indian origin. So again, there's a whole host of people in the political side that have some ties to India that can be helpful. Also in the Fortune 500, in diaspora has produced a list of almost 70 CEOs in the Fortune 500 who are of Indian origin, and most of them are first-generation Indians, okay? So that comes into play as well. And so I think by using this, the diaspora is rising, India is rising at the same time. I think we can help each other grow in stature, grow in influence, and grow in success. So one of the things that the Indian diaspora is also doing in countries where we live is to actually showcase the impact of the diaspora. It's not just generating income or generating wealth, but the soft facts of how the Indian diaspora is helping the countries we live in. For example, in the US, there are about 100,000 Indian doctors, right? Even if you do the math, they serve 10 patients a day. That's millions and millions of patients that are being served by Indian doctors in the US. 7% of the doctors in the US are Indian, right? And this is pretty similar in many other countries Indians live in. Same thing with education. I mean, this is being held at Stanford. We estimate there are between 10 and 20,000 Indian academics in the US. And let's say they teach 100 kids a year. That's millions of students that are being taught by the Indian diaspora. So these are the kinds of things in diaspora is going to be documenting and publishing a report later this year as well, showcasing how the diaspora is also servicing and in the countries we live in. It's not just talking to India, but it's also working with the country we live in. So many, many different things are happening with the diaspora. I think the good thing is the reason the two are growing together, I think we can be helpful to each other. I'll stop with that and come to other
Thank you,
things.
Amar. No, I think the impact of the diaspora, we're going to see even more. In fact, in China's own progress post their liberalization, the overseas Chinese were a major factor in coming in and investing and helping them grow. And I'm sure we're going to see different flavors of that here. In the few minutes we have left, I thought we've got such a great audience. It'd be lovely to get one or two comments or questions.
Don't be shy.
Yes, Christian.
Maybe a question to all of you, probably starting with James. The U.S. is, thank you. The U.S. is going to have an election soon. Can you discuss a little bit, how you think India might feature in that debate and what the consequences of an election result might be for the India-U.S. relationship? Thank you.
That is an interesting question. I think India is much more sanguine about the potential return of President Trump than other Western powers. So I was in Brussels recently, and the just sheer rising panic about this prospect in Europe is palpable. I think in Asia there's more sort of sang-froid about this. I mean, on the one hand, my intuition is, and from talking to people in Delhi around the Prime Minister Modi, they didn't really have all that many problems with President Trump. I mean, they thought they could deal with him, and as I say, coming back to my disagreement with Dinsha, sort of fundamentally, I think because Trump had a quite corrosive, aggressive stance towards China, then many in the Indian security establishment were quite happy about that. They felt he kind of rocked China back on his heels, much more so than President Obama did in the previous administration. I think the risk is that Trump, were he to win, and so I think if Biden wins, then the relationship is on a firm footing and they'll continue and there'll be more development and it'll be reasonably stable and all the rest of it. I think if Trump wins, the risk is that Trump looks at allies and partners and says, well, what are you doing for me? And so he has absolutely no interest in a relationship of strategic altruism, sort of quite the opposite. He's not going to take the attitude of sort of, well, if India's doing well, then that's basically good for us in this amorphous sense. He wants a quid pro quo. And already in Washington, even amongst the kind of the pro-India crowd that Dinsha mentioned, which definitely exists in the Pentagon and the State Department, everyone's very pro-India. They want this relationship to succeed. But there is a sort of underlying concern that sort of we're giving quite a lot to this relationship and we're not getting very much back in return. And that creates a risk, as in they're worried that people in Congress will sort of start saying, well, like, are we getting enough out of this? Is this enough of a partnership? India's not going to support us in Taiwan when we need it. They didn't support us in Ukraine. So we're doing lots of useful things for India, but what are we getting out of it? And I think on the Democratic side, they say, okay, well, let's look at the bigger picture here. This relationship is very strategically important, and therefore, let's just move forward with it, and good things will follow. I don't think President Trump would take that attitude. I think he would want a more sort of specific quid pro quo, and therefore India probably needs to think about how it would manage that. But I feel like India feels that it would be able to manage that relationship. What do you think, Dinsha?
Yeah, I think I wouldn't add much more to what James said. I would mention, however, just in a different dimension, one of the nicest things that we've seen about the election, if we can find anything really heartening about it, we had two candidates on the Republican side that didn't run from their Indian identities at all. Nikki Haley, when her presidential announcement was made, she said she grew up in a town of blacks and whites, and she puts up a picture. I was neither. I was outside, and her turbaned father was there. When she voted in South Carolina the other day, she wheelchaired in her mother. She wasn't running from her identity like we've seen candidates previously. Similarly, Vivek Ramaswamy made the argument that Hinduism links to American values in a beautiful way and talked about his Indian ancestry in a really nice, heartening way. On the Democrat side, you also see people identifying very strongly with their Indian identity. It's a new age for Indians in this country, and it's really heartening to see.
Sriram, and then.
James, you almost did a presumptive close on the upcoming Indian election, which is going to happen much sooner than the American election. So does that have any consequence or change in the way you think about the framing of this?
I'll take this one. At the risk of getting in some trouble. No, I think that, well, we had Rahul Gandhi here last year, and one of the things that was striking with him was that there really wasn't much daylight difference in terms of foreign policy on any number of issues with the prevailing government. He basically said he agrees with the government on Russia-Ukraine at the time. On China, I think he's following that same path. So in terms of foreign policy, I mean, I think we all know who's most likely to win. It's going to be BJP. But even in some unlikely event that Congress comes in, I think we know what we're going to get on both sides.
Okay.
One thing I want to add, though, is in the Biden administration, there are almost 150 Indian Americans who hold very important positions. That was not true in the Trump administration. So I think that's a factor to be kept in mind.
I think I see Amit. Maybe there's one last point, and then we'll close. I think that's it. I think we're closed. Go ahead.
Yeah. Shout it out. It's okay.
Yeah, so I just wanted to say that I want to speak in between Dinsha and James to pick up on your point about aspirational reframing of the relationship, because I see a very powerful undercurrent that's occurring. Having done civilizational studies for about 30 years, I think India is coming into its own. It's getting very confident, and some of that needs to play into a reframing. I think the question I would ask is, how can, when you said, James, that they're not seeing what India can give to this relationship, I think there is a lot, but it needs that reframing. And I think it's so important to move forward in this relationship.
We're out of time.
The United States and India seeing each other as deep civilizations, and what can India bring to the table in this new age of AI with the human values and a lot of fascinating things that it has built.
I mean, I'd say with all due respect, and that's a great topic, will take a long time to deal with, and I see Amit already showing me the...
No, you can just take one more. You have 1 more minute, please.
Go ahead, James.
I think that's an interesting idea. I mean, I think the bigger challenge is that the United States is not a civilizational, doesn't have a civilizational worldview. And in that sense, India has more in common with China. And that's sort of part of the sort of enduring tension that the US liberal internationalism is not really one that deep down India shares. And therefore, that's why I sort of view this as more of a marriage of convenience than a love marriage, if you see what I mean.
I want to add one thing,
Right.
James. I want to add one thing. You said, what is India giving to the U.S.? I think India's export of human capital in the next decade is something the U.S. and other countries will want to have. I call it the geriatric economy that's coming in all the Western countries. They're going to need doctors, nurses, they're going to need staff, and India is going to be able to provide that. I think that's what U.S. is going to get back.
It's surrounded.
All right, I think I'll wrap it up.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I'd say, well, thank you. It was a great conversation. Sorry I couldn't take, I think we're really out of time, so thank you. Let's catch up separately with the panelists after this. So thanks
So,
again.
Rajat,
Amit.
you have
Thank
a comment or
panelists.
you have a question? I have a question.
Okay, go ahead. Amit, as long as we have...
Arun Kumar, on how the diaspora has changed, the changing nature of the diaspora. But how do you think the engagement of the diaspora with India has changed over time? Can you talk a little about that?
Yeah, I think it's changed for the positive in terms of just the bridges, the number of direct flights from San Francisco to India, the 17 flights a week, right? I mean, things... I think the investments. I think there are tons of diaspora investing in India. That says it all in my mind. Why are they investing in India, not in the U.S.? A lot of capital is going to India from the diaspora. Personal wealth is going to India. So that says it all.
And just on the economic, you covered the economic really well, but politically, it's amazing to me when we get, for instance, a group of generals who come, 20 generals might come from National Defense College. You ask them, how many of you have relatives in the US? Half the hands go up, right? That has some kind of effect because they're observing what's going on in this country. They're getting better understanding of what's going on in this country. There's more communication that's happening from a lower level, person-to-person level that then manifests in really important ways for the relationship.
It's a very good point. Great. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for this fascinating conversation, Arun. So we'll quickly... Thank you. So we'll quickly move on to our next talk. We have somebody out here. Can I have your attention, please? Asha, please. Thank you. Thanks a lot. Okay, so we'll get going with the next session or the next part of the program. We have a very interesting gentleman here. His name is Arun Mazumdar, one person who possibly needs no introduction in Bay Area, possibly across the world as well, for a simple reason that he's somebody who created the first school, or who's the founding dean for the first school that was created at Stanford in 75 years. For the Dyer School, he's the dean here. In fact, one of the foremost authorities on climate and energy. Arun, I think you don't really need much more introduction from my side, but one of the most prolific academics that you will ever meet in your life. Arun, over to you for your talk, please. Thank you. Thanks a lot for joining us today.
Thank you. Well, thanks a lot. I don't know if there's a clicker. Is there a clicker? Ah, there it is. Where do you want me to stand? Over there or out here? You're the boss.
You can be here.
Okay.
Thank you.
I want to thank Amit and Richard Dasher for putting this together. For those of you who are not from Stanford, welcome to Stanford. The last time I visited India was in August of 23 for the B20 meeting. This is Chandra, who's the chairman of Tata and also chairman of the B20, happens to be in my advisory board. So he said, why don't you come and join? Which I did. I don't know how Chandra framed it. I mean, the timing was impeccable because India had just landed Chandrayaan-3 on the south pole of the moon, which is an amazing historic moment. And if you combine this with the digital infrastructure for payments, the inclusive growth that the Prime Minister talked about, this is a very different India that I saw than even like 10 years ago. And I just left with a sense of pride. There's a contagious optimism. And there's also recognition that I think India is on an inflection point in its trajectory, which is amazing. I also reminded, when I was on stage at the B20, I reminded people that this is not an accident. When you land on the moon, from the US experience, I can tell you, this is not an accident. This is the tip of the iceberg, and this is the product of an innovation ecosystem that then you recognize the landing on the moon, but there's much more behind. So just to give you an example of what happened in the US experience. When people landed on Apollo 11, 1969, with a call to action in 1962, which I'm going to go back to. At that time, what is now recognized is that whole innovation ecosystem, in addition to the moon landing, produced integrated circuits, cellular communication, lasers, fiber optic communication. The internet, early days on the internet, 1968, was the first communication between computers. Some of you out here, UCLA, Santa Barbara, were involved, and many, many more. So one can ask the question, okay, so India is poised for innovation. What should it focus on? Well, certainly it has done an amazing thing in the digital side. I'd like to offer a perspective which I think is potentially the greatest challenge of this century, and along with the challenge is an opportunity. And is the opportunity to seize, and it's up for grabs for anyone. And the question is, will US and India seize it together? So I'm going to explain to you, in my perspective, of the global challenge, because this is a global issue, and India and US are global players. Okay, so let me fast forward. Okay, so this is the world population. And whenever I've presented this, MR reminds me, you scare the heck out of people. So I'm going to scare you a little bit. But I'm also going to give you the flip side of it, the opportunity. This is the human population. It took 1 million years for the human population to grow to 300 million. And now it takes 13 years to add 1 billion people, okay? This is not exponential, this is super exponential. I call this the human tsunami, yeah? Along with the human tsunami, there's a human consumption tsunami. This is in terms of GDP. I put it in GDP because people are consuming, that's why people are producing, right? And this is a great story for human beings, because without this, we won't have the lifestyle that we have today. We would be an agrarian society of, 150 years ago, right? This is a great story. Our life expectancy has gone up, our health has gone up, all of these things. We have information on our fingertips. That's all this. But it's a consumption tsunami. But to produce that, we have the energy consumption tsunami. And I put this only in the last few, those arrows are my family's generations. I was born in the 1960s in Kolkata, grew up in Delhi. My kids were born here in the 1990s. My parents were born in the 1920s and 30s. They went through this partition, if you recall, some of you. And my grandparents were born at the turn of the century, right? In 4th generation, we went from most of the energy from biomass to where we are today, 80% by fossil fuel. So it should not be a surprise to anyone that there is a CO2 tsunami, okay? And you can extrapolate this to the water tsunami. There's a biodiversity challenge, all of these things. So you are at a university. You'll get a quiz, and your lunch depends on it. No, I'm just kidding. I'm going to throw some numbers at you, and I want you to think about the units. I'm going to give you the units of the first. So 1, 2, 840, 20. The first two numbers, 1 degree Celsius, it's about 1.3 degrees Celsius, is the global average temperature rise from that pre-industrial level. 2 degrees is the max from the Paris Agreement, which India and US were both part of, right? The next number is 800. The 800 is not 800 degrees Celsius. We're not on Venus. If we are to maintain the 2 degrees temperature rise, we have a budget of 800 billion tons of CO2, a global budget, okay? 800 gigs. The next number is 40. That's the rate of emissions of CO2 per year, globally. The last number is obvious. We've got 20 years. That's the next 20 years are likely to be the most important 20 years to address this issue. And when I say 1 degree, 2 degrees, of course, it's just a manifestation, representation of the challenge that we are seeing. These are summer temperatures, NASA data. This is data, not projections. And you can see, some summers are hotter, which are red, some summers are cooler, which is blue. You can see where this distribution is going. And the tail of the distribution, which is the heat waves and the humidity waves, they're reaching places where this is unprecedented. And that tail of the distribution has a more disproportionate effect on the human health, on economies, and all that. So this is what's going on. And so we are in this situation. This is pretty scary. So people have realized that we have to do something about it. So now I call this the defining challenge, because this is not just energy. What happens in energy, we'll come to that, affects water. We all know this. What happens in water affects food, biodiversity, ecology, global health, and climate change affects all of them in generally an adverse impact. This is the sustainability challenge. So people have realized this is a problem. And so the global commitments that have been made in Glasgow, right? India's 2070, US is 2050. The United Nations has sustainable development goals. More than 60%, I'm told, is 80% of the Fortune 500 companies have made some kind of climate and sustainability commitments. They're trying to figure out how to get there. The commitment has been made. They're trying to figure out the details. The details have not been worked out, okay? This is like marriage. You make a commitment, then you have to work out some details, right? So that's what's going on. And no one really has a pathway through. You ask any corporation, if they say they have a plan, please let me know. So given all of this, but the question is, what do we need to do? This is the macroscopic picture. On the vertical axis is CO2 per year, CO2 emissions per year. On the x-axis is time. And so I call this scale versus speed. And if you look at the red line and the blue line and the yellow line, that's the decarbonization effort that needs to be done. It's in tens of gigatons, 50 gigatons per year. That's not enough. This blue line is the negative emissions. These CO2 molecules have to be there, will remain there in the atmosphere for several hundred years. So the CO2, the waste that the West has produced over the last 100 years or so, most of it came from the Western economies, right? We have to remove our own garbage, to put it bluntly. Otherwise, we'll have problems. So this is the macro picture. But of course, this is not going to happen by extrapolation of the past. So how do we address this? I'm throwing out these gigatons as if these are just numbers. So let me give you another quiz. What is the total weight of all 8 billion human beings on Earth in gigatons? Okay? Remember, tens of gigatons. What is the weight? Half a gigaton. Okay? We're talking about new industries that need to be created. And we are seeing early days of that right now. That's the opportunity. So you have multiple gigaton scale, $1 trillion per year industries that need to innovate. Electricity, heating, transportation, you can go down the line, including information. If you look at the growth of energy use and information, it is all the chat GPTs that we do, that takes a lot of energy. So they have to transform. This is the largest transition for humanity. 8 billion people going to 10 billion, $100 trillion economy that is based largely on fossil fuel and with emissions that need to transition in the next 40, 50, 60, 70 years. The next 2 decades, the most important ones. And that's the opportunity to seize. So what has happened so far? Energy innovations of scale in the United States. We have been fortunate with natural gas. That has emissions. But also renewables. This is the first time in history, human history, that renewables at this scale, of terawatt-hour scale, is one of the cheapest way to produce electricity. So it's not a surprise that you're seeing all these investments. Last year, $1.8 trillion investment globally in renewables. In oil and gas, $1 trillion. Okay? So you're almost a factor of 2. Batteries, we all know, electric vehicles, and if it goes down by a factor of just 20, 30% or more, we can have electric vehicles cheaper than gasoline vehicles. And of course, this has been picked up. And let's not forget energy efficiency light-emitting diodes, which are becoming as cheap as incandescent line. So why would you put in incandescent which is more of a heater with a little light source? But this is not enough. There's a lot more that needs to be done. You need multi-grid scale storage at 1/10 the price of lithium-ion batteries. There's small modular nuclear. We can't ignore nuclear. There's refrigerants. This is the cooling thing that, when refrigerants have global warming potential of 3,000 times that of today's refrigerants. Energy efficiency in building. Industrial side is one of the most difficult ones. Maybe hydrogen, right? There's a lot of interest in hydrogen, steel, cement. And there's a standard question that if you can't decarbonize steel and cement, it's going to be very hard to decarbonize the economy. Because that's the infrastructure that we build. Food, by the way, is 25% of the emissions, food and agriculture. And there needs to be this huge sucking sound of CO2, okay? That has to be put somewhere. In the interest of time, I'm going to go. So at Stanford, we realized this is a defining issue of this century. And academia, with business school, engineering, sciences, law, it's not really geared up to address this challenge. Because this is not just a business or an engineering issue. This is all of the above. So we have business schools, engineering, but we decided to launch this, the first school in 75 years, with a vision to create a future where humanity and nature, those 10 billion people and nature can thrive together. But this cannot be done alone. This has to be done in partnerships. The whole idea is to create knowledge, co-create scalable solution. We sitting here do not understand fully the challenges in India. That needs to be co-created and co-developed with partners worldwide. This is about the opportunity of the lifetime. I'm an engineer. Engineers, we generally look at, let's solve the problem. Well, this is the biggest problem we can think of creating knowledge and scalable solutions innovation. I'll give you a few examples. We're sitting in Stanford. This is Fred Terman was the dean of engineering, who had 2 students, Hewlett and Packard. That led to this growth of Silicon Valley, right? And we are sitting here. This is named after Jensen Huang. That's Y2E2. This is Jerry Yang and Akiko Yamazaki. That's Ram Shriram, Google, and Spilker, which is GPS, right? We are the beneficiaries. It started from here as the beneficiaries of this innovation ecosystem. And in the energy area, we have a center after Tom Steyer and his wife of the sustainable innovation. And that has, over the last decade, we've invested just small amounts, 100K, 50K, $6 million. Follow-on funding, $1.6 billion. Okay, so this is how you start to launch innovations, because sometimes for large companies, it's very difficult to move, but small can do that. This is already there. And we felt this is necessary, but not sufficient. We have to think about scale. And we have launched something called the Sustainability Accelerator, which is preparing for scale-up. It's not just startup. It has to be at scale-up. So you have to prepare for the scale-up when you start up from the beginning. And I'm going to harken back to the moon landing from the US perspective now. This goes back to September of 1962, President Kennedy launching the moonshot of we choose to go to the moon in this decade, not because it's easy, but because it's hard. It's an organizing principle to get everyone focused on where you want to go. We are taking that on scale and destination seriously. We have called this accelerator. We have multiple flagships now. The first one is greenhouse gas removal of CO2, gigatons of CO2 per year at less than $100 a ton by 2050. That's quantitative metric. That's where we want to reach. Now the question is, what will scale up? You have to ask the question. And there are many more. Adaptation. This is super important. Adaptation for billions of people against the tsunami of climate change. And protecting land and water, feeding, food security is going to be a huge issue. Right? So we have to work backwards now, just like those NASA people did. Work backwards from the destination, thinking about the scale, and that's what's going on. There's lots of issues. It's not just technology then. It's about finance, about policy, equity, supply chains, education, and at scale, unintended consequences. We are living in the unintended consequences of the 20th century. This at scale will have unintended consequences. We have to think about that. And then you start up to scale up. That's what we're going after. Let me end by, this is our North Star of the school. This is a very different kind of school. It's an all-campus effort. And this is about harnessing all the powers we have. Knowledge, education, talent, innovation, partnership, influence, to really restore it for our kids and grandkids. And in the words of Martin Luther King, who was a big fan of Gandhi, the fierce urgency of now. Of course, he used it for a different reason. And our North Star, real North Star, is a different way of looking at the future. We do not inherit this earth from our ancestors. That's a typical way. We are really borrowing this from our children. So this is all about the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Arun. Thank you. Thanks a lot for taking out time. And this has just been a very eye-opening, fascinating set of numbers that you've shared. In fact, without further ado, we have a very special guest from India who's here, Mr. Amitabh Kant, who's going to deliver his keynote. So for his session, he's going to be speaking for about 20, 25 minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions for about 10 minutes. But I need to introduce this very interesting person that I've known for about a decade or so, or maybe even longer. somebody who's a policy reformer, has been known across the world for somebody who's been absolutely amazing in terms of creating impact. At present, he's the G20 Sherpa. He was somebody who drove what Niti Aayog became or came to be in terms of the impact that was created, especially through its aspirational district program and many other efforts that were actually happening. Somebody who created this whole idea of God's own country. If any one of you have actually heard of it, I'm sure you would have. He's the person who actually created it. And of course, he was also instrumental in this whole idea of ease of doing business. So the lot of changes that you're actually seeing in this country are somebody which were fructified or idealized by Mr. Amitabh Kant. But all of these things are interesting and important. But his only claim to fame that I think is that he's my co-author, and we're just announcing a book called The Elephant Moves. So that is where it is. So Mr. Amitabh Kant, thanks a lot for joining us here today. It's absolutely a pleasure. Please.
Thanks, Amit, for that wonderful introduction. All the distinguished guests. Thanks, Arun, for that wonderful presentation on climate. Ladies and gentlemen, great pleasure being here at this India conference at Stanford. So, I'm truly delighted to be here because yesterday, India announced, or rather today morning, India announced its third quarter result, which has shown that India has achieved 3 quarters of 8% plus growth this year. And in the midst of global slowdown, and India has demonstrated its great ability to grow and to be an oasis of growth at a point of time when there is, Japan, UK, Germany, or all of them are in a recessionary phase. And India has in many ways emerged as a very resilient powerhouse during demonstrating global growth. And according to IMF, India will be contributing about 20% of the world economic expansion in the next decade. And in a world truly starved for growth, India is an outlier. And in the next 5 years, India will surpass both Japan and Germany to be the third largest economy and also will be the third largest stock market in the world. So what is happening in India is that it's a once in a generation shift in its economic position that is taking place. And why it is taking place and how India is moving from being earlier in the fragile 5 to the top 5 economies of the world. I'll briefly dwell on it. And when this government came to power, there was a challenge of what was then called as a twin balance sheet problem of both the corporates and the financial institutions. All the banks were in deep trouble. There was also a challenge of deficits, both fiscal deficit and current account deficits. But where are we now with India? Let me dwell a little bit. One is how this has happened, that this kind of growth has happened. Firstly, I think there's been a lot of structural reform which has been carried out. First and foremost, I think there's been the goods and services tax, which is like putting one tax across entire Europe, because India is bigger than 24 countries of Europe, plus another 30,000 kilometers. It's a cashless, paperless tax. So what it has led to is increasing and widening the tax base from about 6.3 million taxpayers to close to about now 14.5 million taxpayers. And the GST in India is growing at about 15% plus year on year. So that's been a remarkable change to my mind, a huge transformation. And second is coming out with a modern insolvency and bankruptcy code, which has made a huge behavioral change in terms of the credit culture of India, and which has led to proper, for the first time in India, there is proper credit culture management in India, which has enabled India that companies can actually go through a process of dissolution if they are not performing well. And which, to my mind, again is transformational. And third was the Real Estate Regulation Act, because a lot of middle-class people had lost their earnings in India by investing with builders. The government has brought in a huge amount of discipline, transparency through this RERA Act, and the real estate actually, yesterday's latest figure shows that the real estate sector has really bounced in double-digit figures in a very big way, and that, to my mind, owes a lot to this new Real Estate Regulation Act. And fourthly, to my mind, has been the fact that the government lowered the corporate taxes to a great extent 2 years back. It brought India's corporate taxes to the world's best level of corporate taxes. And it's on par with the best in the world today. And that has led to the government giving away close to 1,45,000 crores. And today, the balance sheets of the private sector are actually doing very well, which you'll see with the private sector investment, will soon kick off and will lead to the private sector investing in a big way in India. And I think fifthly was that the huge focus of this government on ease of doing business. It scrapped a lot of rules, regulation, procedures, processes, and which were built up during the socialist era of the post-independence era. And the government has scrapped close to about 1,600 laws, but I mean, there was a huge movement towards making India easy and simple. And it also brought in this huge competition among states. In a large country like India, that was important. The first year, we did the ranking of the states and put it in public domain. Gujarat came number 1. But the next year, Andhra beat Gujarat. And the third year, Telangana beat Gujarat and Andhra. But the good thing was that the eastern part of India, Chhattisgarh and Jharkhand, came 4th and 5th, and they made huge improvement. So my belief is that if the eastern part of India, which is really mineral rich, starts doing well, then India will, and these states will really make India grow on a long-term trajectory for a long period of time. So these are the big ticket reforms which India carried out. But I think the second big thing that India has done in the last few years is this huge technological transformation which India has carried out. And it's very different from the kind of digital transformation that has happened in the West. And if you look at the last 2 decades of the technological transformation, actually all technological innovation has come from the Western part of the world. It's come from Google, it's come from Amazon, it's come from Apple, it's come from all the big, or from Meta, all the big companies of the West, and China, it's come from Tencent and Alibaba. And in India, we took a very different approach, which was to create a public interest layer. And on top of the public interest layer, we allowed private sector to compete in the market space. And this was all open source. This was open API, and this was globally interoperable. And therefore, you had the public identity, 1.4 billion people of India having a digital identity. And then between 2015 and 2017, India opened up 550 million bank accounts, which has not happened anywhere in the world. And that's 55% of the bank accounts opened in the world were opened in India. Every second bank account was opened in India. And Indian women just had 18% of the Indian women had bank accounts. Today, almost close to 91% of the women have a bank account. And then, through a drive, we linked up both the digital identity and the mobile number with the bank account. And that enabled India to do fast payments. And this actually, today India does 46% of the real-time fast payments in the world. Last year, in 2023, we've done 128 billion real-time fast payments in the world. China was next with about 26 billion fast payments. That was the difference between India and the second fastest economy in the world. So what has happened is that I haven't been to a physical bank. I've not used my checkbook. I've not used my debit credit card. I've not been to an ATM machine for the last 4.5 years in India. The only time I've used my credit card is when I came visiting my daughter who lives in San Francisco. And as a consequence of this, during the COVID period, India could put money straight. We did not give out large packages like the rest of the world did, particularly the United States. We put money straight into the bank accounts of the beneficiaries. Within 2 weeks, we put money into the bank account of 341 million Indians, and then we put money into over about 110 million Indian women. And then we put money straight into the bank accounts of 81 million Indian farmers, straight into the account without any leakage. There was no leakage in any of this transaction. While the rest of the world suffered in putting money straight into the beneficiary's account, there was no leakage in India. But and today in India, we transfer money straight into the bank account of the beneficiaries in 670 schemes of the government of India, where when I was a young officer and growing up, in Kerala, money used to be transferred from central government to the state government to the districts, and one of our prime ministers said that actually there was a leakage of 85% of the money being transferred. So today there's no leakage in India because India has become a very efficient economy because we are putting money of the government straight into the beneficiary's account. And secondly, what has happened as a consequence of this digital fast payment was that you had a huge number of young startups who took the payment mechanism and then looked at the history of the payment. And you had MobiKwik, you had Lending Card, you had Pine Lab, who then started giving out cashless, paperless credit. And then you had another set of young Indian startups like Zerodha, Grow, Upstock. Today, Zerodha, Grow, Upstock, they give you stock market creation. They took stock market to Indian Tier 2 cities, Tier 3 cities, rural areas. They do about 30%. They control 30% of India's stock market and wealth creation. And in 30 seconds, you can do a stock transaction. You can get a credit payment in 30 seconds today. And then you had another set of young Indian startups like GoDigit and Aapko, who took insurance. When I was a young officer, it used to take me 6 months to buy a life insurance policy from Life Insurance Corporation of India. Today, they provide, GoDigit and Aapko give you an insurance policy on the mobile, on the go, in a minute. So what India has done is, it's taken credit, it's taken from identity to bank account to digital fast payment to credit to stock wealth creation in stock markets, to insurance policies, all within 30 seconds to 1 minute. And this has been the revolution of India, 30 seconds to 1 minute. Nowhere in the world has this happened. And that is why India brought down the cost of acquisition of a customer. And a company like Reliance Jio actually acquired 450 million customers in India in 10 months flat, because the cost of acquisition in India had fallen from $150 to less than $1. And that is why this has been the big difference which India has made. And that has enabled India to technologically leapfrog, which no other country in the world has been able to do. The third big ticket thing that India has done is that to move from fragile 5 to the top 5 is its huge focus on infrastructure. And it's important to see it, why it's a once-in-a-generation shift. In the last 8 to 9 years, India has made 40 million houses. 40 million houses for its people. And 40 million houses means that it actually created an Australia. It's more than the population of Australia. That's the size and scale of what India has done. It's provided 110 million toilets, which is more than the population of Germany. So every single individual has been provided a toilet. He's gone through a process of behavioral change. Massive amount of infrastructure work has been done. We've provided piped water connection, because many of us are living in urban areas or in the United States of America. We are not aware of this, but 253 million people of India have got piped water connection, which is like giving a piped water connection to every single citizen of Brazil. And we've given electricity to 30 million Indians, and we've actually built 88,000 kilometers of road in the last 9 years. And 88,000 kilometers of road is like making India twice over in terms of road connectivity. That's the size and scale of what India has done in terms of infrastructure creation. It took its capex expenditure of its GDP from 1% to close to 4%. Post-COVID, instead of pursuing a consumer-led strategy, it pushed for a capex-led strategy, and I think it's made a huge difference on ground. And therefore, my belief is that this infrastructure creation will lead to spiraling of growth in the subsequent years of India's economy in the next few years. And I want to dwell a little bit on what Arun talked about in terms of climate, because my belief is that India will make a difference to the world if it goes digital and if it goes green. And therefore, it's very imperative that India takes the leadership. I mean, the rest of the world has grown by carbonizing the world. And India must become the first country in the world to industrialize, to manufacture, to urbanize without a process of carbonization. Therefore, it must be the first country to pursue a decarbonization policy. And therefore, it's done things on size and scale. And India actually uses only 1.3%, of the total carbon space. And it's, if you look at it in per capita population basis, it should be entitled to 17.5% of the carbon space. But 81% of the carbon space has already been occupied by the developed world when it was industrializing and when it was urbanizing. So there's very little carbon space left for developing countries. But irrespective of that, and I want to also say that India has the lowest per capita emissions. Despite 17% of the population, its per capita emissions are only 1.96 metric tons compared to the United States at 14.4 metric tons, and China at 8.5 metric tons. But India is growing, it's urbanizing, it's going to manufacture in a very big way, and it will be the third most polluting country in the world if we don't change our strategy. And therefore, during G20, we took a very action-oriented approach, and we said that the world must decarbonize. And we pursued and we achieved success on having a green development pact for all the developed countries, and which had many components, which many ambitious and action-oriented components. But what India has pushed through policy, through technology, and through finance has been to achieve affordable, clean energy transition. And I want to take a minute to dwell upon it, because no country in the world has achieved 187 gigawatt of renewable energy what India has achieved. And that's the size of what India has done, and its ambition is to achieve 500 gigawatt by the time by 2030. And it has done that at very affordable rate. When just about 4 to 5 years, I think about 7 years back, India's renewable energy was costing 21 rupees. 21 rupees, it has brought it down to 1.99 rupees. It brought it down to 1.99 rupees. I mean, just to give you in dollar terms, from 0.4 cents through transparent bidding processes, it has brought it down to 0.024 kilowatt hour. That has been the radical transformation that India has done by bringing down by enhancing renewable energy in a very big way, but more important, making it affordable by bringing it down very sharply in terms of pricing through transparent processes. But it has pushed for household electrification. It provided about 30 million houses with electrification, but it provided cooking clean energy fuel to over 110 million women in India's rural poor. 110 million women, household ladies in rural areas which were cooking through firewood. It has replaced it by cooking fuel. That's been the size and scale. It aggregated demand, and that's been one of the big strategies of India, to aggregate demand across states, and it then brought about close to 367 million LED bulbs. 367 million LED bulbs, and brought down their cost by about almost about 150% of the cost was brought down very sharply, because sheer size and scale has pursued the same policy in buses, where it did a procurement of 5,600 buses, demonstrated that through a transparent process, you can, on an OPEX basis, you can bring down the cost of electric buses to lower than combustion buses, and the next round of 10,000 buses for cities is just in the process, where I'm confident that the rates for electric buses will fall even further. But I think the most important thing that India has done is really to demonstrate that it wants to pursue a policy of clean energy. But as was said, that it's not, even if India was to do all its electricity as renewable energy, that's only 20% of India's energy. The balance 80% is steel, it's cement, it's fertilizer, it's refinery, it's long-distance transport, and these are all known as hard-to-abate sectors. They don't run on renewable. And India spends about 180 billion in importing fossil fuel to run steel, cement, long-distance transport, energy, refinery, all of this, 180 billion a year. And what India's ambition is that by 2047, we should be an exporter of energy, not an importer of energy, by using renewable energy to crack water, to be a champion of green hydrogen. And by bringing down the cost of green hydrogen from $4.5 a kilogram, which is now, to bring it down to $1 a kilogram by the time of 2030. And this will require size and scale, population scale transformation, and which many of our young entrepreneurs are driving. It's being driven by many big companies, many young entrepreneurs. Some of them are sitting here, like Greenco, Acme, many of these young entrepreneurs, and it's also being driven by many of the big ones. But India's hunger, its ambition for transforming India as a leader of climate change, because it is climatically blessed, is unlimited. And you see that in the young entrepreneurship of India. And therefore, my belief is that India believes very strongly in net zero being net positive for India. And many leaders say that when you move from fossil fuel to green, there is a green premium to be paid. I mean, that's what Bill Gates says, that you'll pay an extra amount. What India has demonstrated is that it's not green premium. India's done it at green discount. Every single area, because of the size and scale of India, because of the enterprise of India, because of the young dynamism of India, India is able to do it at a much lower cost. And that is why, whether it was buses, whether it was LED, whether it was renewable energy, we were able to radically bring down costs in climate change. And India will do this in electric vehicles. India is doing it in two-wheelers, where the two-wheelers, electric two-wheelers and three-wheelers, and India runs on two-wheelers and three-wheelers. 70% of India runs on two-wheelers and three-wheelers. And India is going to see a huge urbanization. 500 million people are going to get into the process of urbanization in the next 5 decades. So you will create two Americas. You can't repeat the mistakes which the West has made. You have to follow a path which is led on public transportation, on cycling, on walking, on buses, and that's why India is pushing for Indian railways to become totally electric in 2030. And therefore, the fourth biggest thing, in addition to these huge structural reforms, in addition to the digitization of India's economy, in addition to pushing for infrastructure, has been the huge focus on India becoming the first country in the world to transform itself through a process of decarbonization. And therefore, my belief is that Prime Minister himself is passionately pushing for what he calls as lifestyle for environment, that you make people pro-planet. And one of the studies by IEA says that if people themselves switch off lights or switch off taps or are able to switch off vehicles and bring behavioral change, and we nudge them to make behavioral change, you will actually save 21% greenhouse gas emission. And it's not countries or political systems which will make a difference, but it's citizens like you and me and communities which will make a difference to actually making the country green. And therefore, we are pushing for this. But having said all this, let me also say that having given you this perspective, let me say that there are very, very many challenges for India. And there are challenges, but these are huge opportunities for India. And the challenges, to my mind, are that it can't be that India is growing on the back of the southern part of India or the western part of India. India needs to grow in an equitable manner, and therefore the eastern part of India must grow. They are the mineral-rich states of India. And therefore my belief is that Bihar, Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, UP has done a stellar job in the last few years in infrastructure creation. Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, all these states must grow to enable India to grow at 10%. India's ambition is to be a $35 trillion economy by 2047. It will not happen without these states growing. And therefore, states have a critical role to play. Center has done its job, and now the states must transform themselves to be the leaders of growth. And therefore, growth with equity, with the states driving growth, is critical. When the rest of the world was growing, it grew on the back of global trade growing. Trade was very, very accretive to GDP growth. USA, Europe, all grew at a point of time when global trade was growing. The global trade is at a standstill. It's not growing, it's not expanding. Global trade has become a bad word in today's politics. And therefore, it's necessary for India to still grow, because India's share of the global trade is still very low. And it'll be very difficult for India to grow without exports. And that would mean that India needs to manufacture again to size and scale to penetrate global markets in a big way. And therefore, my belief always has been that it can't be that India is growing only on the back of services. India needs to fire on all cylinders. It needs to become a manufacturing nation. It needs to grow on the back of sustainable urbanization. But more than anything else, India needs to enhance its agricultural productivity. One of its many challenges is that there's a very high population dependent on agriculture. You can't have 20% of your economy coming from agriculture. The rest of the world is 4 to 5%. And therefore, if 42% of your population is dependent on agriculture, it's too high. You need to take it from agriculture to manufacturing to urbanization. And it'll be very critical that by doing this, you will enhance your productivity in agriculture, and that'll be critical for India in the coming years. And I think lastly, to my mind, it's very, very important that we improve our learning outcomes, which is very good, which is very critical to my mind, because India has been able to provide a school to every single child. But it needs to improve learning outcomes, on which there is a huge focus now in the new education policy. It needs to improve its health outcomes. It needs to improve its nutritional standards, and it needs to really focus on women, for which the Prime Minister has laid a lot of focus on through the women-led development. And I think really take care of the women, because a weak pregnant mother gives birth to a weak child who's then stunted or wasted. And therefore, now the country is laying a lot of focus on improving learning outcomes, health outcomes, on nutritional standards. And these, to my mind, will be huge challenges, but they are probably the biggest opportunity for India. And if it can do transformational work in these few areas of growth, India has a massive potential to grow at high rates of 9 to 10% per annum for the next 3 decades, and to be a $35 trillion economy by 2047, because it'll be a very, very young country. Its average age of population is just 28 right now. It has very low dependency burden. And even when it becomes 147, the average age of population will be just 35 years. The rest of the world is aging. Europe, America, China, East Asia, all are aging. India will be very, very young. And rarely has a country not grown at high rates when it has low dependency burdens. So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
So why don't you sit here? We'll just have time to take about a few questions. If you have any questions here, please. Any questions, or everybody is absolutely stunned? Okay, so we have a question in the back. There was somebody who raised her hand.
Hello, sir. I'm Akshita. I'm a student at Stanford GSB. I came from India back in September, so only a few months here. But my question to you is, you said a lot of great things, and I think the outlook is mostly positive towards India. What do you see as one big risk that maybe lowers your faith in the future of the country? That could be on any front.
So to my mind, the biggest challenge for India is really to improve learning outcomes for its citizens, because, by 2047, actually, India will be providing 30% of the skilled manpower to the rest of the world. I mean, there'll be no manpower available in Europe and America. It'll all be coming from India. So you need to actually improve learning outcomes, and you need to skill them in a very big way, not merely for tech, but you need to create carpenters, you need to create electricians, you need to create plumbers, you need to create all kind of workers. Look at the hospitality sector, for instance. All the great managers of Four Seasons and Ritz-Carlton used to come from Lausanne School of Switzerland. Nobody will go there. You'll all have Indian general managers running all these hotels because only Indians will be traveling everywhere. So you need to really skill them for the next century. For 2047, really. That's the biggest challenge to my mind.
Okay, time starts now. Right. Thank you, sir, for your focus on the learning outcomes. I'm from Room to Read India. My name is Shakti. My question would be, what kind of quality learning outcomes do you envisage for India, which has to grow tremendously, emerge as a leader in the next 20, 30 years? So learning outcomes, the ones that we deal with today, do they need an overhaul? Do they need a change?
Yeah, they need a radical overhaul, because both the ASR study and the NAS study all demonstrate that very substantial percentage of a population, of a young population, class 10th student is not able to solve the class 4th, forget maths or physics, even is not able to grasp his mother tongue. And that's happening because, 25% of the children are outstanding, they're brilliant, they're getting into the next class. But you don't test them again and again and again and again, so they keep passing classes, keep going on, and keep going on, next class. But once you've not grasped the basics of what you've been taught in class 3rd or 4th, then you'll never be able to grasp class 5th or class 6th or class 7th. And that is what is happening in very many parts of both semi-urban and rural India, and even urban India. And therefore, I think one of the great things we should work with Stanford is on how to improve, how to use technology in a very big way to improve learning outcomes in India. It can't, to scale. Because what India has demonstrated in many ways is, even digital transformation or climate or infrastructure, is it's done things on population scale at low cost, which no other country has been able to do. India should be able to do that in both learning and health outcomes, using technology to transform India in health and education. And that, to my mind, is where good collaboration with Stanford is required.
One last question. We have a gentleman here, please. One with the turban, please. Can we just give it to him?
Thank you. Hey, very fiery speech. Thank you so much. I think the question is the small, medium enterprises, right, and the rest of the world contribute anyway 50 to 70% GDP for most of the world. In India, I think we call it MSME. I think for the India to grow to 2047, MSME will play a big role. What are the policy changes that the government sees for the MSMEs or SMBs in India? That's the challenge that we foresee.
So, on this question of MSME, government has done a lot of work on this in terms of digitization, efficiency, et cetera, but I'm a great believer that India needs to get the size and scale of manufacturing right. India needs to have thousands of large companies. I mean, it can't grow on the back of just few large companies. It needs thousands of large companies. Because large companies create the, Maruti actually in the automobile sector. And automobile sector is important because 7% of India's manufacturing output comes from, 7% of India's GDP comes from automobile sector. But Maruti then created Tier 2, Tier 3, Tier 4 manufacturer. There's a backward-forward linkage between the big manufacturer and the small manufacturer. And therefore, it's very essential that we need thousands and thousands of large companies in the world. Indian MSMEs will grow and prosper. And that will enable India to, and that's why we designed the production-linked incentive scheme, that you grow bigger, biggest, and large in a period of 5 years' time. We'll support you to grow big. And India needs to do that for enabling MSMEs to grow in a very big way. That's very important. Because, you look at the global configuration. I mean, if you look at the global GDP, there's only one country in the world whose share of global GDP, its share in the global GDP has actually remained steady, and that's the United States of America. That's 25%. Europe has fallen from 30% to 15% and will fall even further. China has grown from 3.5% to close to about 18.5%, 19%. And India is now accelerating the pace and filling up space. And therefore, its share will go up because as it accelerates its growth. But to accelerate its pace of growth, to have a larger share of the global GDP, it's very important that you have large companies who are able to manufacture. It can't be done on the back of services. It needs to be done on the back of manufacturing in a very big way. And that requires millions of MSMEs to create jobs, because jobs will come from MSMEs. But there's there has to be integration and convergence between large companies and MSMEs.
Thank you. Thank you. I think this is where we will call it a close. In fact, you'll have more time to interact with Mr. Kant towards the evening as well. But just a couple of very quick announcements. We'll break for lunch. We'll reconvene at 2:15. And there is a small exhibition in the room back there on Jyotirlingas. So it's pictures that were taken by Connor Martin and Vibhav, who are both here, who are going to be sharing their views in the evening. So would request you to have a look at the exhibition as well. So that's going to be something very interesting. Thank you, Mr. Kant. It's absolutely a pleasure. And I think he deserves a standing ovation, please.